You are standing in a stone plaza the size of a small city, thousands of soldiers surround you, golden ornaments catch the sun, litters carried by nobles move through the crowd. You are the ruler of the most powerful empire in the Americas, and in less than an hour, you will lose everything. This is not a metaphor, this actually happened. In November of 1532, an army of 168 Spanish soldiers walked into the Inca city of Cajamarca and captured an emperor commanding tens of thousands of warriors. Within a year, the largest empire ever built in the Western Hemisphere was finished. For centuries, the story you were told was simple: superior weapons, steel versus stone, guns versus slings. A tale of brave conquistadors outsmarting a primitive civilization. That story is mostly wrong. The real reason the Inca Empire collapsed so fast has almost nothing to do with the battle you picture in your head. It has everything to do with something that arrived years earlier, long before a single Spaniard set foot in Cajamarca, something invisible, something the Inca never saw coming, because you cannot see a virus, and you cannot fight an enemy that has already come and gone before you even know it existed. Let's rebuild the timeline properly. By the early 1500s, the Inca Empire stretched more than 2,500 miles along the spine of South America. From modern Ecuador to Chile, it connected coastal deserts, glacial peaks, and dense rainforest through more than 24,000 miles of engineered rope bridges made of woven grass span canyons that swallow sound whole. Runners called chasquis relayed messages in a relay system across brutal mountain terrain faster than a horse could manage across similar ground in Europe. Historian John Hemming, who spent decades reconstructing the fall of the Inca in his landmark study of the Conquest, described an empire so administratively advanced that Spanish observers were stunned by its granaries, its irrigation systems, and its record-keeping. That record-keeping deserves a pause, because decoding it changes how you should picture this civilization. The Inca had no written alphabet. Instead, they used the quipu, a system of knotted, colored cords that encoded numbers, census data, tribute records, and possibly narrative information. Anthropologist Gary Urton has spent years attempting to decode surviving quipu specimens, and his research suggests these knotted strings functioned as a sophisticated accounting and communication system. Capable of managing an empire estimated to hold somewhere around 10 million people, this was not a primitive society waiting patiently to be conquered. This was one of the most organized, tightly administered states on the planet at that moment in history. So how does an empire like that fall apart in a single year? Here is where the evidence stack begins. In the 1520s, before Francisco Pizarro ever crossed the Pacific coastline into Inca territory, a disease moved south from the earlier Spanish contact points in Central America, smallpox. It traveled ahead of any European soldier, spreading person to person along the exact trade and communication networks the Inca had built to unify their empire. The same roads that carried grain, textiles, and messages also carried a pathogen the Andean immune system had never encountered before. Demographic historian Noble David Cook, who studied population collapse across the early colonial Andes, estimated that epidemic disease killed a devastating share of the Andean population in waves, some of which began years before any direct European contact with the Inca heartland. The Emperor Huayna Capac, ruler of the empire at what many consider its peak, died from this same wave of disease around 1527. He never met a Spaniard face to face. The single most powerful man in the Americas was killed by something that had not even physically landed on his coastline yet. Sit with that for a second. The empire's collapse did not begin with an invasion, it began with a death that had nothing to do with conquest at all. And that one death detonated everything that followed. Huayna Capac left no clear, agreed-upon successor. Two of his sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, split the empire into rival factions and fought a brutal, exhausting civil war for the throne. This war lasted years and devastated the very infrastructure that had made the empire strong in the first place. Roads engineered for trade and administration were now used to march armies against each other. Granaries built for famine relief and long-term food security were emptied to feed soldiers fighting their own countrymen instead of outside enemies. By the time Pizarro's small expedition arrived in 1532, Atahualpa had just won the civil war, but his empire was exhausted, fractured along regional loyalties, and still reeling from a plague that had killed uncounted thousands, possibly including experienced generals, provincial administrators, and elite bloodlines who carried the empire's institutional knowledge. There is archaeological confirmation of just how deep this crisis ran, and it comes from an unexpected place. In 1911, explorer Hiram Bingham brought international attention to Machu Picchu, an Inca site perched high in the Andes that had never been found or looted by the Spanish. Later excavation and skeletal analysis at sites across the former empire, including work synthesized by researchers studying Andean bioarchaeology, has shown clear signs of population stress in this exact window of time. Skeletal remains from the early 1500s show malnutrition markers and irregular burial patterns consistent with a society under sudden, severe strain, not the steady rhythms of a stable, thriving population. Cross-referencing these skeletal patterns with Spanish chronicler accounts and with Cook's demographic estimates gives you three independent lines of evidence pointing at the same conclusion. Written testimony, population data, and bones in the ground all agree, the empire was already collapsing internally before a single conquistador arrived at its gates. Now picture the scene at Cajamarca itself, because the details matter more than the summary. Atahualpa arrives at the meeting place with an enormous ceremonial procession, thousands of attendants surround him. He is confident, curious, and completely unprepared for an ambush, because nothing in his experience has suggested an army this small could pose any real threat. He commands tens of thousands of battle-hardened soldiers camped nearby. The Spanish, by comparison, have cannons, steel swords, and horses, animals the Inca have never seen before in their lives, but weapons alone do not explain what happens next. What actually decides the outcome is shock, surprise, an emperor's court that walks into an open plaza unarmed, as a gesture of diplomatic confidence. Spanish soldiers open fire from hidden positions around the square. Cannon blasts and sudden cavalry charges into a dense, unarmed crowd trigger pure chaos, not a fair fight in any sense of the word. Atahualpa is captured within minutes, pulled from his litter as his own attendants are cut down trying to shield him with their bodies. He later offers an enormous ransom, a room filled with gold and silver. In exchange for his freedom, the Spanish accept the gold, they execute him anyway. Here is the counterintuitive twist most people never hear in school. The Spanish did not defeat a healthy, unified empire through superior tactics and superior technology alone. They walked into a state already bleeding from a civil war, already grieving a shattered leadership structure, and already devastated by a disease epidemic that had killed a staggering percentage of the population before direct contact even began. Later waves of epidemic disease across the wider Americas are estimated by some researchers to have eventually killed the majority of indigenous populations within a few generations of first contact. The conquest you learned about in school was less a clean military triumph and more the final collapse of a structure that was already cracking from the foundation up. This reframes the entire narrative of superior technology wins. Technology mattered in the specific moment at Cajamarca. Horses, steel, and gunpowder mattered, but timing mattered more than any single weapon. A functioning, unified Inca Empire at full strength, with its road network intact, its granaries full, and its leadership united behind one emperor, would have been an entirely different opponent for 168 men to face. The empire that fell in 1532 was not the empire at its peak a decade earlier. It was an empire already in the middle of its worst internal crisis in generations, hit by an external shock at the exact moment it was least able to absorb it. Now bring this back to you. You live in a world built on networks, supply chains, communication systems, transportation grids, all of them optimized for speed and connection, in much the same way Inca roads and Chasca relay runners optimized an empire for administration and control across impossible terrain. And you have likely already lived through a moment where you watched how fast an invisible threat can move through a connected system, faster than any army in human history could ever march. A pathogen does not care how advanced your infrastructure is. Sometimes the very networks that make a civilization powerful are the same networks that make it vulnerable, because connection cuts both ways. The Inca built the roads that let them rule an empire spanning a continent. Those same roads carried the disease that helped end it before a single battle was fought. There is one more layer worth understanding, because it explains why the empire could not simply regroup and fight back the way you might expect a nation of millions to do. The Inca political system depended heavily on the person of the emperor himself. The Sapa Inca was not just a ruler, he was considered a direct descendant of the sun god, the central node holding together a web of regional loyalties, marriages, and tribute obligations. When that node was thrown into chaos by a contested succession, the entire administrative structure beneath it lost coordination at exactly the moment it needed to be strongest. Regional leaders who might have united against a small foreign force instead hesitated, uncertain which brother actually held legitimate authority, or quietly sided with the Spanish hoping to settle old scores from the Civil War. Pizarro understood almost none of Inca cosmology or governance, but he did not need to, he only needed to recognize a fractured chain of command and exploit it, and multiple accounts from Spanish chroniclers describe him doing exactly that within days of Atahualpa's capture, turning regional resentment into support for the invaders. Empires rarely fall for one clean, simple reason, they fall in layers, quietly, from causes most people never notice until the visible collapse happens on camera, or in a plaza, in front of an army that assumed its enemy was small and unprepared. So picture it again, a plaza, thousands of soldiers, an emperor confident in his empire's strength, standing at the height of everything he has ever known, and an outcome already half decided before a single shot is fired, not because of the men standing in front of him, but because of something that had already moved through his empire years before, invisible, unstoppable, and completely out of his control.